Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chuck Friedman. I'm the chair of the Learning Health Sciences Department in the University of Michigan Medical School and one of the two co-chairs of the LHS Collaboratory. Delighted to be here with you today, and I'll be making a few introductory comments and introducing our speaker for today, Julia Adler-Milstein. A few housekeeping matters. First of all, this session is being recorded. The recording link will be shared with all attendees and registrants. The session is closed caption. Now, we hope to have a very, very interactive session today. You're going to find Julia's presentation, I'm sure, to be extremely informative and thought-provoking. We're asking you to post your questions in the Q&A pod throughout the session. Doug Van Houweling will be monitoring the Q&A pod, and Julia will be stopping her presentation at selected points as her presentation unfolds, specifically to entertain your questions while they are still fairly fresh and relevant to the material that she has presented. You'll also be able to unmute to ask questions. Doug, as I said, Doug Van Houweling will be moderating the Q&A aspect of today's session, and please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A pod. You'll also be able to use the chat pod throughout today's session. Looking ahead to future activities of the LHS Collaboratory, we're really delighted that Chuck Mail will be presenting on the learning health system activities in our own radiation oncology department on January 18th. We'll be entertaining Jeff Brown as a speaker with a discussant to be named soon to talk about distributed health data networks that support learning health systems. Jeff just left Harvard University to take a position as Chief Science Officer at Trinetics, and he will bring a very, very important perspective to this very important topic. And that will be on February 24th. And then on March 22nd, we will have our own Dave Williams, who heads the network-based research unit at our own institution, teaming up with Kathleen McTeague of the University of Pittsburgh, which is the home of the PATH network, the PCORNet network, to which we belong, and they together will be giving you a perspective on network-based research, both from the institutional and the network perspective. In the case of the PATH network, I believe there are 8 institutions, including Pittsburgh and Johns Hopkins and others, in addition to us, involved. So that will be January, February, and March of next year. We are also currently planning activities for April and May, and we will announce those as soon as those are finalized. So today we have with us Julia Adler-Milstein from the University of California at San Francisco, and she'll be speaking on the current state of interoperability and implications for learning health systems. Very, very relevant topic to what we all are about in the collaboratory, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing her remarks. I want to perhaps set some of the tone for Julia's presentation by giving you a little bit of backstory, and this goes to my own experience from 2007 to 2011 when I was the Deputy Director and Chief Scientific Officer for the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. And for that reason, I was, and actually Julia was at the same time, involved in the very early years of the U.S. Health IT program. And I can begin my little backstory by saying that interoperability that enables trusted health information exchange has always been a cornerstone of what was originally known as the U.S. Health Information Infrastructure. In 2005, a paper appeared in Health Affairs, of which Julia was a co-author, estimating that in current dollars, health information exchange could save $78 billion a year, take that much cost out of the system. And of course, if one extrapolates those numbers both for inflation and for the expanded size of the healthcare expenditure in the US, this figure would be much larger now. Among the reasons why there's great interest in this topic. In 2006, then Health and Human Services Secretary Mike Leavitt coined a very interesting way of describing the challenge and the goal, the idea being that every person's health information should virtually follow them around and be available to inform their healthcare wherever they happen to be. And partially in response to this vision, but also because health information exchange was always, as I said, a cornerstone of the national health information architecture. ONC built a prototype network that was known as the Nationwide Health Information Network. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about this that demonstrated, as Julia will emphasize, that it's very easy to talk about interoperability and health information exchange. It's very easy to draw pretty pictures like this one to illustrate how it might work, but it's a whole lot harder to do. And a little bit of a story. In September of 2008, after several years of development of the Nationwide Health Information Network, ONC boldly and with some anxiety planned a demonstration of how this would work. And they would do this live in the Hubert Humphrey building, that beautiful piece of 1960s architecture shown below, which is the headquarters of the Department of Health and Human Services. And we're going to do this live in front of the Secretary of Health and Human Services and others. And I think you can see where some of the anxiety came from. 9 of the state-based nationwide network exchanges that had contracts with the ONC were going to participate. And in fact, this was all 9 of the contracted exchanges. And what they were going to do, even though they would each have terminals in the large auditorium of this building, each terminal would actually be connecting back to through the internet to the home exchange of each of the participating units. So what was really entered into these terminals in the building would be executed through the actual exchange architecture that had been developed. And the idea was to show several scenarios over demonstrating interoperability and health information exchange, reflecting several clinical applications, such as one that was very famous of someone who collapses at a football game and is rushed to the emergency department. And just in the nick of time, when that person is about to receive a medication, a message comes through the network alerting the medical staff of an allergy that this patient has to the medication that was about to be delivered. All of this was predicated on the network actually functioning as intended, and it's a good thing they did a rehearsal. They actually got everybody together a few weeks in advance in another building and did a rehearsal. And of course, even though every exchange had been built to use the common standards and other accoutrements that would make the network work, when they turned the thing on and tried to run these scripts for the first time, absolutely nothing worked. And it took them quite a bit of time to iron out the bugs, which was done, fortunately, before the scheduled demonstration. And the demonstration actually came off quite well. But I think the key point here is that everyone thought they were ready and that everything should work perfectly. And in the event, nothing worked. And this is an illustration of how challenging the problem of health information exchange, both from a technical and a policy perspective, which really wasn't an issue here, as you'll, but how challenging both the technical and policy issues are in actually making health information exchange and trusted health information exchange work. That was 2008, and as I turn things over to Julia, I will just remind everybody that everything changed in 2009 when President Obama, with now President Biden looking over his shoulder, signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which contained a great deal of resources for health information technology, reflected in two titles of this act. One, providing funds in the sum of $2 billion to the ONC to carry out Title 13, the development of and support of health information technology itself, and Title 4, which contained an unspecified amount of funding for incentives to hospitals and providers who were eligible to receive these incentives to achieve these, if they achieve the status of meaningful use. And how all of this played out is another story. But one of the major activities that the ONC undertook with its appropriation of $2 billion was to stimulate interoperability and health information exchange. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Julia. I hope you found that backstory interesting to set the stage for her presentation. Julia is currently Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for Clinical Informatics and Improvement at UCSF. She holds a PhD in health policy from Harvard, and after receiving that PhD, actually stayed there in very, very important staff roles. She moved to Michigan to take a faculty position in 2011, stayed at Michigan in the School of Information, where she did great things until 2017, when she was recruited to UCSF. She has authored multiple very, very influential publications on EHRs and interoperability. She's a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and she has served on many, many influential advisory committees. I'm sure you're going to very much enjoy Julia's presentation. Julia, I'll now turn things over to you, and let me thank you for being here today and sharing your thoughts with us.
Well, thank you so much, Chuck, for that incredibly wonderful introduction. And if I can find my slides, which now are not, let's see. Okay, always the moment of truth. Okay, hold on. They're not showing up in my window. Just give me 1 second to close it out and open it again, and then we will be good to go. Yes, well, I just want to say it was funny seeing you talk about that 2005 paper when I was truly like a lowly research assistant, just a few years out of undergrad, and not realizing at all that the opportunity to sort of think about and study and try to quantify the impact of health information exchange would be sort of so pivotal in my ultimate research trajectory. So it is amazing to be here now, almost 20 years later, thinking about and talking about these issues. Okay, so hold on one moment, because for some reason I'm just not seeing my slides, which is very unusual. So just give me 1 second to figure out why they're not showing up as a little share screen option. Okay, sorry, these are the moments that you really do not like when the technology is not working as you want it to. Let me see what I can do here. Okay, let me open it up one more time and hope that it pops up. Okay, share screen, there they are. Okay, phew. Well, this topic is one that I do really love presenting on and talking about, but one that is very, very hard to cover in any sort of depth in 90 minutes, frankly, let alone 90 hours. So I have tried to, share what I think is like an assessment of the current state of interoperability in the US, and I will talk about then some implications for learning health system efforts. But undoubtedly, I will miss, some important aspect of this. And so I do really hope in your question and answers, you will bring up what you feel like is the most relevant and timely dimension of this topic so that we can try to address it. So I want to start with actually what is probably the most substantive part of my talk, which is the context and definitions. How do we really understand what it is that we're talking about when we say health information exchange, and start to sort of peek and preview into why it has been so hard to achieve at a national scale, something that we all agree is very important. It's never that I've never been in a room when someone said we should not be pursuing health information exchange, that this is not valuable or important. Yet it's actually been something that despite, now again, more than a decade of federal policy effort, a lot of effort at the state level and others, it can feel sometimes like we haven't made much progress. So I really want to give you a sense for why it is that it's been so challenging. I'm going to return a little bit. Again, Chuck gave you a preview of some of the policy efforts, but just to think about the policy evolution, because while a lot happened under the HITECH Act, there's actually been ongoing, really substantive policymaking to try to advance health information exchange. So to give you a sense of sort of where we are today with this policy arc, and then give you my diagnosis as sort of summarizing the causes of the slow progress. And then I'll end with some thoughts on implications for the learning health system at sort of different levels of scale. And I'll pause in between each of these sections so that we certainly can take some Q&A and have discussion. So Chuck alluded to this already. It was just really the perfect setup for this talk. What does everyone want? They want their information to be there at the moment that a healthcare decision is being made for them. And I think what we all see and recognize is that our information is siloed. It sits within different organizations and frankly, within the different information systems within those organizations. And so what that means is across our lifetime, our health information ends up in these very different silos. And the goal is to figure out how do we bring that together so that a clinician or frankly, anyone else that's trying to impact our healthcare decisions can have access to the relevant subset of information. So again, it's just think a very, very simple idea and not one that, that people struggle to understand, like what would this look like if done well? But the reality is that making it happen is incredibly complex. And I had to steal this slide from Jitin Asnani, who many of you may know. He led Commonwealth Network for many years. To try to sort of understand all of the different players in this space who in some way or another are working to advance health information exchange. And what I really like about this is frankly the two axes, because what they help understand is that health information exchange is actually not just one thing. It exists at a lot of different levels of scale with different pieces that sort of layer together. And unfortunately, all these pieces aren't really working well in a coordinated network. That's actually one of the sort of current policy initiatives we'll talk about in a little bit. TEFCA, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, is to actually weave some of these different efforts together so they can talk to each other. But right now, there's sort of anything, from very locally, community-bounded health information exchange efforts, all the way up to efforts that are trying to really pursue HIE at a national scale. So that's the x-axis. And then you also have groups that are really just focused on building the technical infrastructure, the data pipes. How do we move data across disparate systems? And then you have entities that are thinking not just about moving data, but actually trying to do something with the data. And so whether that's creating a really synthesized, longitudinal medical record, or putting the data together to help with, whether it's public health use cases, population health. So I think this gives just a nice sense, again, of sort of how different players have perhaps aligned themselves on these two axes. And they're all doing health information exchange in one form or another. but it can look really different depending on sort of where you sit on this, on this set of axes. And then there are also players who sort of operate, technically more on the periphery. They're either doing convening functions, they're developing standards that are used for HIE. Again, also a really critical set of players that would say that they are also working on HIE, but are really sort of trying to create some of the conditions and enablers that allow these other efforts to actually move the data and allow it to be used for its intended purpose. So again, I hope as I'm trying to set up to just try to help understand how to make sense of this complex space, I think this is a nice place to start. And then even within that, it can get even more complicated because there are lots of different ways to move data around. We often sort of simplify this as a notion of a push. So I have a piece of information and I know where it needs to go and I'm going to push it to one organization. So we often call direct or directed exchange is one that's a model for how do we enable push exchange. There's also pull or query. How do we sort of send out a bat call and say, okay, which system out there might have some information about this patient that's here today, Julie Adler-Milstein, and then information will come back in response to that query. Then there are API-based exchange. Again, I'll talk about this more in a minute, but this has sort of been, again, in the federal policy evolution, we're now really pushing API-based exchange where systems have sort of a standardized front door so that one could come to, UCSF Health's EHR and say, hey, do you have anything about, Julia in that system? And then there would be sort of a standardized set of data that could be returned. And so a bunch of types of organizations that are sort of promoting API-based exchange, and in particular, some of the FHIR standards that can complement APIs to help ensure more standardized data that are coming through APIs. And then we're also seeing a lot of new companies that are really pursuing interoperability as a service and trying to do a lot of this, middleware integration so that, any given effort that wants to access data from multiple systems doesn't have to go and sort of build the infrastructure themselves. And so this sort of emerging notion of interop as a service. So again, it can just, I think, feel confusing and overwhelming, all the different things that are out there that are pursuing different types of exchange and approaches to exchange. And so I hope that some of these frameworks just start to help you organize the different approaches and sort of how they differ. And there's not like one right way. I think at the end of the day, we need all of these and they all are going to sort of serve different needs and use cases. And so a lot of the complexity is just figuring out how they're going to all come together to solve this ultimate goal of getting the right information to the right place at the right time. So why is this so hard? This is my attempt to sort of explain the type of alignment that needs to come together for information, not just to move across the healthcare system, but actually get in front of the right person at the right time to make a decision that's informed by better data and information. So at the highest level and where a lot of the federal policy effort has lived is around, the policy frameworks, the standards, the services, the technologies in sort of a broader sense and business models, right? We need to be able to have that sort of environment that is conducive to people actually working to advance moving data across disparate systems. And so, things you could imagine that live in this cloud are things like, approaches to patient matching, to patient consent, different types of standards that we're going to use like FHIR to help move data. So there's a lot of work that just needs to exist to make sure that some of the sort of necessary pieces of policy and policy approaches exist. And frankly, I think the number one thing in this cloud that we often forget about is incentives, right? Are the entities that hold and want to move information, do they have incentives to share information? And I think, unfortunately, we haven't really built a strong set of incentives. And I will come back to that a little later in my talk. So assuming that we can sort of get this cloud of things aligned from a broad ecosystem perspective, then we actually need the structural capabilities to move data around with the appropriate governance and protections. And frankly, I think we've actually made a huge amount of progress in this layer, the structural capabilities layer. So the ability to move data across disparate systems today is vastly beyond where it was, even 5 or 10 years ago. So the ability to move data, I think, is further advanced. It's not perfect. There's still gaps, but I think we do have a lot of the sort of key systems connected up and capable of sharing data. But now what we're starting to realize is that that's not enough, that we actually need to equally invest in some of the organizational processes to figure out how to use all these structural capabilities. How do sort of, if you imagine pipes, right? Like you then need to think about, okay, well, what's coming into the pipes and how do I route those pipes to the right, sinks and showers and, whatever else it may be, so that you have the water where you need it in the right, in the right places. And so again, health systems like Michigan Medicine, right? You have a lot of pipes coming in. And you now need to think about where do we put that information in our EHR? Who do we show it to? When? And that's a lot of work that frankly, we're just starting to do now. And I don't think that there's a lot of clarity around the right way to do that. So getting those organizational processes are sort of the key next step. And then last but not least, the person who is looking at that, what we often call outside information, right? Information that they didn't generate or that didn't come from sort of their home organization. They have to understand it, right? Like who produced this test result? And what was the context in which this test was run? And do I trust the interpretation of this data such that I can use it in my own decision making? And we've heard that, there are often times when, an academic medical center will say, well, yes, I saw that test result from, a community hospital, but I want our own radiologists to read and interpret it. And so even though we did everything right, we actually got that outside piece of data to the right person at the right time. At the end of the day, they said, I'm not sure that I trust this. And I want to sort of, recreate this information before I feel comfortable using it in a decision. And so again, we have to get through that last piece of the human decision maker who can really say, I think this information is good and worthwhile, and I want to use it to influence my decision making. And it's really only when all of these pieces align that we get to a place of saying, okay, HIE is going to be expected to improve an outcome of care for a patient or for populations. And so that's where I think, you start to see how hard it is to get all of these pieces to align, especially at a national scale, and how much work we have to do at each of these layers to get that alignment and have the ultimate impact. So the first key point is that, again, this notion of health information exchange is simple. Like, how do we just get prior health information available to anyone who might need it? But it's very, very complex to operationalize given all these different layers and approaches. I also think, frankly, something that has slowed us down is a lot of finger pointing. Like, why don't we have interoperability and who's to blame? And a lot of finger pointing is pointed towards EHR vendors. They build proprietary systems. They have, either charged high prices or been, otherwise made things difficult when asked to sort of be more open and interoperable. Oftentimes, it's the provider organizations who will say, well, they'll get blamed for saying, well, our health data is a proprietary asset, and why would we want to share it with our competitor down the road? Just makes it easier for a patient to go down the road and get care. Some people will say, well, no, like neither of that's right. If the incentives, if vendors and providers are better off holding their data as opposed to sharing it, then it's the policymakers who've gotten it wrong. They have to create the market incentives for vendors and providers to want to share data and to be better off. And sometimes you'll also hear, well, like it's the patients. If they demanded this, then they're the real consumers in all this. And so you need the consumer demand for the economics, so to speak, to work. And so my personal take on this is that I think, yes, every patient wants this, but there's really no option to use a patient's market power. Like you can't go to a different health system because like interoperability is a network, right? It requires everyone to play nicely. So I'm going to take the patients off the hook. If you want to argue with me about that, we can do that in the Q&A, but I don't think anyone really feels like it's the patient's responsibility or that really they have a way to demand this. But the three other stakeholders, I think the answer is yes, yes, and yes. I do think it's critical that policymakers create the right incentives. And I think they should, frankly, create much stronger incentives for the vendors and the providers to share data. But I also think that there's some really important actions that the vendors and the provider organizations should and could be taking that could help advance HIE, again, particularly around those like last mile issues around saying, okay, well, now we have the ability to take in all this outside data. How do we actually start to implement that in a way that gets that information to the front line and to decision makers? So I do think there's really key coordination that has to take place across the vendors, the provider organizations, and the policymakers. But those are three big sets of actors. And so again, to make progress that requires coordinating the policymakers, the providers, and the vendors is complex. Those are sort of, again, three distinct groups that each are trying to, I think, make progress, but getting them to work together in a coordinated fashion is challenging, and it just takes time. And so again, I think part of the slow progress is because of this multi-stakeholder coordinated action that's required. Okay, and last but not least, this is my third point, which is that, I think we have a vocabulary problem in this space. So this term HIE is used, and I think it can just mean so many different things to so many different people in different contexts. In some cases, it can just be referred to almost as a noun. We'll say HIEs as some type of an organizational entity that enables data sharing. In other cases, we use it as a verb, just the movement of data. Again, neither of those is wrong, but it's not clear, if you're referring to an organization, what organization, or if you're referring to the verb, like, well, who's sharing what information in what way? So these terms are general and don't sort of get at the specificity that's needed to really understand what's happening. If you then think about, well, like, so how is HIE occurring? There's also just a set of sort of different options for how that connectivity can take place. So one is just, right, we have all these different information systems that have patient data, like we should just connect them all up to each other. And frankly, at the start of the HIE movement, that was really what we started to do, was just build custom interfaces between systems. But it was very clear from the start that, like, that was not nationally scalable. Like, in some communities, you could perhaps do that, but that approach wasn't going to scale. But what's interesting is now that we've moved towards an API-based approach to exchange, it's in some ways the same notion, but you're not doing the custom interfaces. Instead, you're just basically putting a front door on each of these systems so that they can talk to each other via an API. So I think what didn't feel like it was scalable at the start, interestingly now feels like is sort of back on the table as an approach to nationwide HIE. But since APIs have come on the scene, I think a lot of the work prior to that was this option too. This notion of sort of lots of different systems that sort of all connected up to something in the center. And this is not necessarily like a giant data repository that sucks up everyone's data. That does not exist, certainly at national scale. But this is more like a centralized air traffic controller that's saying, okay, what information lives where, and how do we sort of move that information through, through something in the center that does at least the governance piece to make sure that that information can move across systems. But again, we don't have a single center, right? We have all these different networks that are, connecting all different sets of stakeholders and moving all different types of data. And so again, while this exists in different places today, it can look really different depending on where it's sitting and how it's operationalized. I do also just want to touch on this third option, even though, again, it hasn't really come into existence. But I think, many people considered, like, well, why shouldn't the patient really be at the center of this, right? If it's about their data, aren't they the best unit to sort of pull all the data together and move it around? And I think, version 1.0 of this, which was, personal health records or, smart cards or things like that, like, it just hasn't really taken off for a variety of reasons. But it's interesting now, again, that APIs are sort of our chosen approach to help enable exchange. And patients, have a right to access under HIPAA to their records, which is a very strong right, actually, that I think we underutilize as a vehicle for health information exchange. And they can get that information increasingly on their smartphones. So there's, again, some notion of maybe this coming back as a new option for how to move data around. Though, again, even with API-based exchange on smartphones, like, we just haven't seen a lot of uptake. So my personal opinion on this is that it should always be an option, but I don't think going to become the national standard for how we move health information around. I think most patients don't want that burden, frankly. They just want the healthcare system to do it for them. And the people who really invest in these are ones who see that the healthcare system has failed to do that and feel like if they don't do it, no one will. And so it's sort of an option of last resort rather than anyone's preferred option. So again, it's important, I think, to talk about it, but I think we really need to get these other options working better so patients don't feel that they have to do this if they don't want to. So let's see, I think, we've talked a bit about, FHIR and APIs. It just, to be in the HIE space today, I think it's really important to have at least a high level understanding of, what APIs are, which is really a common architecture that allows functions like creating, reading, updating, and deleting information from a system. And so it's just a way to get information in and out of, of any information system. But in our case, when we're talking about HIE, it's primarily about, electronic health records and lab information systems and pharmacy information systems. How do we have an API that can help move data in and out of those systems for purposes of exchange? And then FHIR is sort of separate and apart from APIs, right? That you can have an API that is not FHIR based, but what's, I think, really important about FHIR, which is that it's a common language that can be married with the architecture of APIs that basically allows data to move in and out of an API at a data element level. So what you're going to ask for from from an EHR is a medication, not an entire record. Because there are many HIE use cases where all you want is a particular type of data, not the whole record. And the ability to use FHIR is to sort of ask for that medication in a standard way. And so it really moves interoperability from a notion of a document level exchange, like give me the patient's record or give me a summary of their record, to give me, all of the medications that this patient's taking. And so that's why I think it's been something that's been so exciting as sort of a new way to do HIE, is because we really can then work with data elements, exchange of data elements rather than documents. So I'm not going to go into the standards in a lot more detail. Again, there's so much to say here, but I just want at least sort of to touch on these because they're so front and center in HIE conversations today. So what is this key point that I've been getting to? It's just there's such substantial heterogeneity in HIE capabilities, whether you're talking about any given organization, a region, or at a national level. And so when someone says like we're doing HIE, it almost to me is a meaningless statement. And what you have to ask is, okay, well, what? Like what type of data is being exchanged? Is it the entire record? Is it the entire legal medical record, which is actually a subset of the entire record? Is it some kind of a summary of care record, like a subset of the legal medical record? These days, we have this notion of US core data for interoperability, which again is a set of data that's only a subset of the entire legal medical record, but is what we are requiring that EHRs be able to share to meet federal policy requirements. So again, that's a set of data. You could say, yes, we are able to exchange what's in US CDI, and that will define a set of data elements, and that will actually expand over time, which is, I think, a really important policy vehicle that will help increase the volume of data that's exchanged. And in some cases, really, exchanges are really built just around a couple of types of data. So there are HIEs in this country that really just focus on delivering test results. And so again, that's a much narrower set of data. So if you just say we do HIE, but really all you're focused on is test result delivery, again, that's still valuable, but there's such a wide breadth of data that can exist in this what column. So it's really important to understand, like, well, what data is being shared? And then there's this question of how that I touched on, right? So is this data available via some kind of view only, right? Where, there's a portal you can log into and see the patient's data, but it's actually not even moving. Some people will call that HIE and other people will say, well, that's not really HIE. So where do we sort of sit on that spectrum? Or is there something where, from within your home system, you can have, single sign-on or some other way to seamlessly be able to, log into another system that has outside data? Or are we really talking about sort of fully integrated internal and external data where there's like a real blending of the data that's in the local system and the data that's coming in from outside? And very rare to find that full level of integration. More often than not, we're sort of in somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. And last but not least is the who. Like, who is participating in sharing data? Is this like all healthcare stakeholders in a given region or in a state or nationally, post-acute care, mental and behavioral health, payers, emergency medical? Again, very rare to find that full spectrum of participants that are, contributing and able to receive and access data. More often than not, it's like the core set of clinical providers in a community, the health system, perhaps some community hospitals, some independent practices that have signed on. And again, in some cases, it's even more limited than that. It will be, only those that are using a particular EHR vendor, or only those that are, in a particular, geographic region. So without asking the what, the how, and the who, I think you can't really understand when someone says we're doing HIE, what it means. And so and the answers you will get if you ask these three dimensions will vary a lot, depending on where you are in the country, what type of organization it is, and sort of what's available for that organization to participate in. Okay, so let's see. I think I'm just going to skip through this. This is a little bit more definitional stuff. I'm going to wrap up this first section. And I just want to note that everyone agrees, right, that we need HIE and some level of interoperability, which is sort of the more sophisticated way that systems can talk to each other that doesn't require humans to be in the middle, which effectively just requires real adherence to standards so that when data is moved, the system can understand what data is being moved. And again, Chuck alluded to this, that part of the reason that we believe that we need HIE is because we know that we have a fragmented healthcare delivery system that's fragmenting information, and that there are estimates that we could improve safety, effectiveness, and primarily efficiency if we could sort of seamlessly and using data standards exchanged information. But the real question is then, how do we make it happen? And sort of what is the right mix of a really heavy top-down regulatory approach and a much more sort of bottom-up market-based approach versus some type of a hybrid approach where the government is taking some key actions, but leaving a lot of it to the market. And so that's, I think, frankly, every country that I've studied is trying to figure out what is this right mix of sort of what should be done from a regulatory perspective, and really what do you leave up to the market, to the to the healthcare delivery organizations, to the vendors, and I don't think we know exactly the right answer. And so we're still, again, just sort of trying to experiment with different policy actions, and then seeing how the market reacts, and then continuing to sort of modify this interplay between regulation and market actions. Okay, so let me just pause there. I know a couple questions have come in. Doug, I don't know if you want to describe a few of them, or I can just read through them. And
why don't you just go ahead, and if you've got them, it's fine with me if you read through them, Julia.
Okay, sounds good. So the first question here is around consolidation, and I'm really glad that this came up, because we are really seeing consolidation in terms of all the different HIEs and HIE approaches that are out there. I think we're seeing that many of them sort of can't exist at their current level of scale. And so you'll see local HIEs that are in the same state, merging with each other. And we're also then seeing these emergence of these larger national networks that are both connecting to some of the smaller networks as well as connecting to the EHR vendors directly. And so this question is really about the equilibrium, how are we going to see all of this shake out? And is there a path forward, frankly, for some of these smaller networks? And I think, the question is really going to be about what you do with the data. And so I do think we're at a place now where if all you're doing is building infrastructure that moves data, I think that's going to only exist at a national level pretty soon, with these sort of, some perhaps state, but certainly I think these national networks that'll connect directly to EHR vendors. So I think the national networks are going to do, a lot of the sort of just commoditized data exchange functions. And so then it's a question of, can you then layer on top of exchange other value-added activities that your particular set of participants, those who are, sending you data, find, useful and worth paying for. And I think we're seeing a lot of HIEs do that and do it successfully, and others not. And so, I think we will continue to see consolidation. And I do think at the end of the day, we'll sort of have a few large legacy HIEs that are doing a lot around value-added services. Frankly, I think the pandemic has created some really interesting new opportunities for HIEs to sort of help show where they can add value. But I think a lot of them probably won't figure that piece. And as data exchange gets more and more commoditized, and probably not going to go into QHINs and TEFCA in a lot of detail today, but like I think that TEFCA is only going to push us more towards commoditized data exchange. And so I think again, it's just going to be harder and harder to be in the business of just moving data. And so it's going to be about figuring out sort of what other business models there are for HIEs, at local or state levels. So again, there's a lot more to say there. It's almost hard to get into that just in a couple minutes. But I'm definitely watching TEFCA and the development of QHINs very carefully because I think it could really shake things up. But we don't know. TEFCA is voluntary. It's not clear sort of who's going to participate and in what way. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that that's sort of going to eclipse, all the current approaches to moving, moving information around. Okay, so now the question about national patient identifiers. I mean, I wish I knew the answer to this. I think there's a lot of, first of all, just misunderstanding about national patient identifiers, that a lot of people think that it makes their information less secure, when in fact, instead of using an NPI today, what we're doing is using a lot more highly, personal and private information about you, like your address and your social security number and your birth date. So I don't know. My wish is that we could do a better job of educating people about the value of a national patient identifier. But frankly, it's been so long that we've needed one, and we've come up with all of these workarounds that I'm not optimistic. But you just never know when a policy window will open up and you can get something through. But I do think we would have much more secure exchange and probably more efficient exchange if we could use an NPI, but the other solutions, the workarounds we have now, I think are working fine. So it doesn't really feel like a huge pain point that could actually, I think if things were going wrong more often, it actually might create more momentum towards solving that problem. But I think we do a reasonable enough job, unfortunately, with just using all these other types of information to do patient identification and matching. Okay, let's see. How far into various PHI containing applications do you think our system goes? Andrew, I might defer on this one. It's a really good question, but it's, I think, just going to get us a lot into. So let's maybe come back to this at the end if we have time. But it's it's a great question. And then let's see. Circling back to provider use of diagnostics from other institutions, it's a very practical concern. Yep, useful addition treatment plan. Okay, so the outside interpretation is a useful addition to but not saving money. Is there a way to address this? Yeah, so I think the question is sort of that it could be a very reasonable decision to want to repeat a test, even if you can see the test from the outside organization. And again, at the end of the day, this is about what the expert, the clinician, thinks is needed to make the best care decision for that patient. So I think the interesting question is like, what additional metadata, since I think this group knows what metadata is, or provenance data, what might we need that could help that person feel more comfortable relying on outside data? If they think no matter what, I would just need to repeat that test, right? Something new has happened to the patient in the last week, then there's nothing you could do. The patient clinically needs that test redone. But if the clinician were to be told like, okay, well, if I could tell you more about the organization in which this test result was generated, I could tell you more about the experience of the radiologist who interpreted this image, then you would actually feel comfortable relying on it. That's when I think we'll need to think about not just moving data, but actually moving the metadata and the provenance data. And maybe then we come up with, some type of an approach to help that clinician better understand the context so that they would feel more comfortable using it. This is like very cutting edge notion. Like I haven't really heard. I don't even think many people are sort of at the point of thinking about these issues of like, how do you show outside data in a way that makes it more perceived as more sort of trustworthy and reliable? I think, again, these are important questions, but ones that we haven't even scratched the surface on answering. So again, a really interesting question, and more maybe to come back to at the end for Q&A if we have time.
Julia, we also have some questions in the chat.
Okay.
The first one is from Mary Wise. She wonders if even if we had a patient-centric system of managing data, wouldn't there need to be some kind of a backup which would point back to some sort of centrally oriented system? In other words, if you're going to use the patient-centered data model, then you also have to have a hybrid that makes the data accessible for a patient who isn't participating. Is that what you think?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. So I mean, I agree. I don't think right. If we used only the patient-centered option, it would mean like that full responsibility would have to sit with the patient or the data wouldn't move. And so I don't think that is realistic or the right move. So I think the question is, should it be an option? So that we have sort of both, one way to move data that's just from, provider organizations to provider organizations, and then also have a sort of patient-centered option that wraps around it. Maybe that's the right model. Again, I don't think there's like a right or wrong answer here. And what we've done now is just to try to pursue both, because neither one of them has been so successful that it's felt like it solved the whole problem. But perhaps if we get the provider to provider data sharing right, then the need for patients to do this might fade. Though again, there are other reasons that patients should just have access to their own data, where they may find it useful to understand and manage their own health. So that's a different use that I think is really important. But I'm talking about just patients as moving around their own data from provider to provider. And I think that piece, my sense is, would fade away if we could get the system to just do it for them.
And then another question in the chat was, and I think you may be going to get to this later in your presentation, is what's the role of the payers, government and commercial, to help in this evolution? They often act as proxies for patients who can't understand. My sense is that you're going to discuss this later, but.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I am, but let me just briefly say that, yes, I mean, I think payers have a really important role to play, both as an intermediary for the patient, and because at the end of the day, if we do this well, the benefits accrue to the payers. And as much as we sort of don't think about the HITECH Act as a payer intervention, it is a payer intervention, right? It's CMS as a payer saying, we are going to invest in digitizing the health system and investing in HIE. And so it really was an intervention by the largest payer in the US to try to take action. And I think it's left a lot of the other payers not quite sure how to, act, because again, this is such a fragmented space with so much that's happening. And so I think different payers have sort of either sat on the sidelines or really, I mean, in your state, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan has been very active in partnering with your state HIE and building use cases for providers to engage. So I think payers can have a very positive role in promoting HIE. We saw it at the highest federal level with HITECH and the Meaningful Use Program. But I think other payers haven't quite sort of been able to figure out like how to use sort of their place in the market to best drive HIE, because it has been sort of fragmented.
Okay, well, I bet you it makes sense for you to get on with the next section,
Okay.
And then we'll come back to some of these questions.
Perfect. That sounds great. These have been terrific questions. So as I alluded to, right, if you look at what the US and most other countries have done, is they've taken sort of a hybrid approach with policy actions that try to stimulate HIE and create the conditions for HIE to be successful. But at the end of the day, it's really still left up to the market. So this means that, the networks and the vendors, they're the ones that have to recruit the participants and, sort of put the infrastructure and the governance in place to share information. And so what you get is just many different ways that HIE is occurring. And frankly, today, if we were to say how much information is still shared in using manual processes of fax and phone, there's a lot. And so while a lot of exchange has become electronic, it's hard to quantify, but, I'd say that, there's probably an equal amount that's still happening using manual methods, particularly when you think about the continuum of care. So information that's going from a hospital to a skilled nursing facility, or from a skilled nursing facility to a home health agency, their facts, still reign supreme. So we still have a lot of work to do to really, I think, fully shift to, digitized health information sharing. But again, we've made a lot of progress, particularly among, doctors and hospitals and those who receive the high-tech funding. So let's talk a little bit about the policy actions directly. So I think, again, Chuck, already talked about some of these early stage efforts. So the establishment of the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT really was done with a recognition that we needed a national coordinating entity around some of these health IT issues, and that HIE needed some kind of a central coordinator and convener. But the first really substantive action to try to incentivize the market to pursue HIE came with the HITECH Act and meaningful use. And if you go and look at the original legislation, health information exchange was one of the 3 functions that Congress explicitly called out as what the dollars should go towards. And so it's always been front and center as something that was really important to have as a policy priority. But I think ONC faced and CMS, frankly, faced a really hard challenge up front, which was sort of, do we just get EHRs adopted and then figure out how to connect them together? Or do we try to push both of them at once and to say, you can only implement EHRs that are also already able to share information with each other? And frankly, it was a fairly quick timeline that the high-tech dollars had to get out the door. And so I think there was a decision to sort of slow down the HIE piece and get EHRs in place, get to sort of some basic meaningful use around data capture. And then the sharing piece didn't really come until stage 2, and then what was supposed to be stage 3. And I think looking back, this is where reasonable people can disagree about whether that was the right or wrong decision. Because what it did is it essentially put systems in place that weren't really structured to be interoperable with each other from the start, and then tried to sort of say, okay, well, let's at least make sure that a system is capable of sending a summary of care record during a patient transition. But then there was nothing there that said, okay, that system on the other end needs to be able to receive it and integrate it. And so, it was a fairly low bar, but it was a low bar that could be achieved at the time. And so, it was sort of this, I think in some ways it feels like we've been trying to play catch up ever since, with trying to get the HIE to be a more substantive part of meaningful use, and to make sure that the vendors themselves can build and get EHRs certified that support HIE, and then to make sure that the provider organizations are actually engaging in HIE in a meaningful way. And so, mostly then this jumps to the 21st Century Cures Act. I just didn't want to miss the Affordable Care Act, because I think part of maybe what was hoped that the ACA would do here is to create some stronger incentives to share data, that, as we move towards, new models of care delivery, like accountable care organizations and bundled payment, that all of a sudden now a single provider organization is responsible for an entire population of patients, no matter where they get their care. And so that might motivate better information sharing, because you need to be able to, share information with the other organizations that might be touching your attributed patients. And I think we've seen that a little bit, but frankly, not a lot. And so that's why my little affordable care icon is smaller, because I think it maybe was a little bit of a nudge, but not enough to really complement what was happening under HITECH in a way that sort of really propelled HIE forward. So the next really big step came with the 21st Century Cures Act that I think is a just direct result of feeling like progress on HIE under HITECH was too slow. I think, our Congress people heard that there was a lot of frustration with EHRs and how they weren't able to share data. I think everyone felt like, well, I see EHRs, but I don't see HIE happening. And so I think Congress really felt compelled to say, like, why hasn't this vision for what HITECH was supposed to accomplish happened? There was a set of hearings about it. The Senate Health Committee took this on in a very substantive way. And we got the 21st Century Cures Act that really is what brought API-based exchange to the table to say we need a new technical approach to share data, and has really sort of ushered in the modern era of, what's now meaningful use, which has been folded into MIPS and MACRA. And anyway, it gets very complicated very quickly. But I think the short answer is that 21st Century Cures really has pushed us to where we are today, where EHRs and also payers now need to make their data accessible via standards-based APIs. They have to be able to share the set of data that's within the US core data for interoperability, which will expand over time. And so I think we're now, in the really early stages of implementation of 21st Century Cures. And whether this is going to be it and we'll finally have cracked the HIE nut, or whether we'll need the next big piece of legislation around HIE is really an open question. But I think I'm much more confident that 21st Century Cures is going to get us to where we need to be, and does sort of help modernize the approach to HIE in a way that I think will sort of get us to a pretty reasonable level of federal level interoperability. But again, it's early days of implementation of cures. And so, we'll see if I'm right or not. So that's sort of where we are today, is implementation of 21st Century Cures. This also the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, TEFCA, came out of this. So again, a lot within 21st Century Cures that we're really trying to help push HIE forward in multiple ways. And then I just did note the CARES Act, and it's hard to talk about HIE without talking about the pandemic and just how it exposed that public health HIE was just in a state of real neglect. So almost everything that had happened along this policy pathway had sort of nodded to HIE for public health use cases, but it hadn't really been front and center. And I think with the pandemic, it's really put a lot of particular attention on helping address HIE for public health use cases. So electronic lab reporting, electronic case reporting. And so again, I think we will see progress there, but I think, again, there's even fragmentation. There's one approach to electronic case reporting. There's a different approach for electronic lab reporting. It can look different in different public health, jurisdictions. So we continue to just see a lot of fragmentation and variability in the approaches, even though, again, I think we're making incremental progress, but, in all these different areas. So again, that's a very quick, but hopefully gives you sort of a sense of the policy arc and trajectory here and sort of where we sit today. Okay, so let me, I'm going to try to get through this next section, relatively quickly, because we've touched on a lot of these points already. But if I had to say, what is my diagnosis for slow progress? It's really the confluence of three factors. The first is just what is the end point? At what point do we plant the flag and say, we have an interoperable healthcare system? I don't think we've really had clarity or agreement on what the end point is that we're trying to drive to. And then it's just hard to coordinate all the different stakeholders who need to help get to that endpoint without that really clear sense of the finish line. So I think that has been one piece that's been hard, is that different groups are coming together to pursue different HIE use cases, but it's not clear sort of how all of that work fits together to try to advance us towards, an overarching finish line. We've talked a lot about just the fact that there are numerous difficult barriers that span domains and require coordination across multiple stakeholders. So to make progress, we have to solve, technical issues, policy issues, business model issues. And so again, to make progress on all those different types of barriers simultaneously it's hard, and it's slow going. And last but not least, I really think that there's just insufficiently strong financial incentives to overcome the barriers. That engaging in really substantive high impact exchange is not a stay in business activity for an EHR vendor or for a health system. It's almost a nice to have at best. And so given how hard it is to make exchange happen and work, if they're not really strong financial incentives to make it happen, we just shouldn't be surprised that progress is slow. It's never going to be number one on the priority list. And on a good day, maybe it's, number 3 or 4. And so, I think as a country, we have to make a decision of, do we need this to be a top priority issue for health systems and for EHR vendors? And if so, I think the direct, tangible financial incentives need to be much, much stronger. And that's, if I could wave my magic wand and put a new policy in place, it would frankly be just much stronger financial incentives to engage in sort of substantive information exchange. I think we now have the technical underpinnings to make that a reality in a way that we didn't have at the start of meaningful use in high tech. So I do think now is the time to say, we have APIs, we have FHIR out there, and now we need the incentives to get those sort of integrated into, sort of daily healthcare delivery. So let's see, I think, anyway, this is just a lot of detail on, on those 3 points. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into all of the detail. But just to summarize that, I think, again, the sweet spot is how do we create incentives for the outcomes that we want, that we think are sensitive to good health information exchange. So the best case scenario would be to sort of articulate the outcomes that we want for our patients or for populations that we think good HIE should achieve, and like incentivize those outcomes. And at the same time, lower barriers to interoperability. And I think, the more that we can do to make interoperability a sort of core part of the different information systems that are being used, EHRs are one, but lots of other types of information systems that are out there, the easier it will be if it's sort of, if the technical approach is just a core part of sort of, most of these systems, so that the customers don't have to sort of demand or push their vendors to have these capabilities. What worries me is that I think we actually are doing quite a lot to lower the barriers, but if we look at the incentive side of this equation, there's just not that much happening. So yes, we've incorporated HIE measures into new payment models like MIPS, but again, they're just one of many different types of measures that are in there. It's just sort of one approach to HIE that's incentivized within MIPS. Again, bundled payment and value-based payment, it's been helpful, but only I think really as a nudge, not as like a wholesale, change to the economics of, of provider organizations. So I think we need to do a lot more on the incentive side. And we're just doing so much on lowering barriers to interoperability, right? We have all these API requirements and FHIR and USCDI. We have the trust exchange framework. We haven't even talked about information blocking. I know it came up in the questions, but there's this whole new set of regulations with information blocking and exceptions to information blocking, and fines that will be levied for organizations that are found to have been information blocking. There are a bunch of federal efforts around consent, patient matching. There's just a lot going on. It's a little tongue-in-cheek to say, is it too much? But it's just figuring out how all of these pieces are going to come together. I think doesn't always feel obvious. And so it is, if I could perhaps shift some of the effort and attention from the right column to the left column, I think we might see faster progress. Okay, let me just pause there and see if we should take a few more questions. My last section is sort of shorter and almost more theoretical, but I don't want to miss it because this audience is, I know, working a lot on LHS issues. So Doug, is there like a couple questions that you think are?
Yes. So in particular here, we had a question in the chat regarding financial incentives. When the EHR vendors partook of the federal incentives under ACA, did they also commit to interoperability, or was it just sort of forgotten about in terms of the requirements?
Yeah, so the vendors met the letter of the law. I mean, they met the certification requirements, and then the provider organizations met the associated meaningful use criteria. But I think everyone agrees that the bar was set quite low, and that what was required in sort of the first stage, because the goal was that everyone could get over the bar. And so, I don't think we really held vendors to a very high standard. And again, it was for, I think, a reasonably defensible position, because if very few systems can get certified, then the provider organizations aren't going to be able to implement a certified system and meet meaningful use. So sort of, but I think the key was, did we raise the bar enough over time? And that's maybe where we could have pushed the vendors more. And frankly, it's what 21st Century Cures, I think, did, was come in and say, we really need to raise the bar and shift what was required of vendors, which is the ability to sort of produce and transmit electronically a summary of care record, to saying, no, EHR vendors need to be able to have a standards-based API and to be able to, produce, a FHIR adherent set of US CDI data elements. So I think we really have raised the bar under 21st Century Cures. And again, as I said, it's just early enough that we don't quite know, like, did we get it right this time? I'm optimistic, but I think it's not, we don't know yet is the answer.
Mark Savage asks, are there incentives for other stakeholder groups using the learning health system besides the providers? For example, payers, patients, public health, research?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there are what I would think of as direct incentives, where it's sort of obvious that we've created an incentive system that sort of directly promotes investment in better HIE. But I do think that there are sort of some indirect incentives that exist. And I think, again, if you talk to payers, for example, like, they're very interested in better access to data about their patients, doing more population health management, addressing disparities. So I do see a lot of payer engagement. And I think that they are feeling like, if they can do more with respect to HIE, they'll be, better able to sort of fulfill some of the new initiatives that they're working on. So again, I do think everyone is interested. Like, there's enough incentives that people are interested in coming to the table and sort of experimenting. But it doesn't feel like there is a lot of things that make it feel like a stay in business issue. I think for me, that's, if we really want fast progress, like, this needs to feel like, okay, if we don't get this right, like, our bottom line could be so vastly impacted that we could actually risk going out of business. Like, that's what moves organizations quickly. And again, it's a big risk to take. Policy is not usually in the business of taking big risks. So I'm not optimistic that we'll see this, but I just think we have to recognize that the strength of direct incentives is going to directly correlate with how quickly we move. And if not, we'll just continue to make incremental progress, which is not a bad thing. It just will take us longer, I think, to get to where we all want to be.
So Andrew Rosenberg asked the question about the blocking issue, which you can probably see. Yeah.
Oh, I feel conflicted about how to answer this, because I think so I think information blocking as a concept was really powerful. And the fact that we even are talking about this notion of organizations actively interfering with appropriate exchange of data, we needed to have that conversation. We needed to name it, and we needed to say that it's wrong, that it's working against our societal interests to have information blocking. So as a concept, I'm very supportive that it exists, and then we talked about it. Now we have this set of exceptions. It is like incredibly complicated to figure out all the ways in which people might be engaging in information blocking or might be appropriately not sharing information. It then will have to go through an entire process of effectively like a court case level assessment in order to prove whether someone was information blocking or not. So I think the teeth of information blocking was just in the concept and the awareness and sort of the fear of being labeled as an information blocker. I think the actual policy implementation of information blocking is like not where the power of it lies. It's just going to be complex and frankly, I think kind of a mess to figure out like who can legitimately be proven as an information blocker and who is actually meeting one of the exceptions appropriately. It's been, if I were a health system, it just feels like a headache, right? To try to figure out whether you are information blocking or not. It's unfortunately sometimes policy at its worst because it has to be so specific and in the weeds in order for people to know, did I information block or did I not? And it's just been so hard, I think, for, most organizations to figure out like when it's appropriate to withhold information and when it constitutes information blocking. So good luck, Andrew, figuring all that out.
And then Amy Nutman asked about whether or not there's ignorance on the part of other payers, rather than just people who directly deliver healthcare, I think, that has contributed to the slow progress here?
Yeah, I do think that most, entities, if you talk to like, Business Roundtable or, other sort of large employers, like, these issues are on their radar. I think they very much see and realize at a high level that HIE would be valuable to them. But then I think this question of like, so how do I use my market power to act in a way that could actually make a difference? That's a much harder question to answer, because there's, again, all these different activities at all different levels of scale. And so figuring out how, for example, as you said here, the, auto and workers' comp actors could get involved in the HIE space most effectively. Like, again, I think it's a hard question. And so, I think that's where maybe we maybe haven't taken as much advantage of their interest and given them an answer to that question. Again, I think for states that have like a mature exchange framework, there's probably an opportunity to sort of help advance state level activities. Overall, I think that using contracting as a vehicle, so sort of requiring that provider organizations that you contract with are investing in HIE is like a really interesting market-based strategy that I'm starting to see sort of gain some traction. So there's certainly options out there, but I think part of the hesitancy has been like not really being sure which is the path for action that's going to be sort of most effective as a payer who's sort of not always necessarily in the middle, but like is very appropriately at the table as different sort of HIE discussions are happening.
So why don't I let you get on then with your last section here on implications for LHS.
Perfect. Okay, sounds good. Well, I feel like I can't give a talk here without showing this slide. And it's probably evolved since even my version of it that I inherited from Chuck. But I still think this is very effective for the point I want to make, which is that, data itself, right, like underpins, at least two of the cycles, sections of the learning cycle. And when we talk about HIE, at its most fundamental level, it's about getting access to the data that one needs to understand the problem of interest. And so when information isn't flowing, we are impaired in our ability to turn data into knowledge and then to assess the performance piece to turn it back into data. So I see many, different types of efforts that are bumping into our like lack of good HIE as a country as they're trying to pursue different types of learning health system projects, right? They perceive it as like data that's siloed and inaccessible that makes it hard to pursue progress on their health problem of interest. So again, I think there's this intuitive connection between lack of good HIE and the ability to really get through these cycles smoothly and with all the data that one would need in an ideal sense. But let me just put a little bit of a sharper point on it and talk about two particular challenges. So one is like within a single health system, right? You can't, without good HIE, you can't get complete data on the individual. And so, where we see this is that like where exchange HIE capabilities exist, it's like not always well aligned with where patients are going to get their care. And so you can't really know what happened to a patient after they were seen in a hospital because you don't know or have information about all the different places that they went next. Did they get readmitted to another hospital that you may not, be aware of? So I think we see sort of complete data on the individual as the first place where with better HIE, we could do a better job of learning about what's working for a given patient or not. And I think the other place where this starts to be a problem at perhaps a higher level of LHS scale is that there's just like oftentimes we lack standardized ways to capture and exchange types of data that are important for LHS efforts. So if I take as an example, patient-reported outcomes, or we could take, any other, like many other types, like all the work that's going on within Gravity around social determinants and social needs screening. Like we just don't have standard ways to capture this that everyone is using. And so even if you can get the exchange piece right, what you're then left with is like lots of different ways of coding and using like the outcome that you want to be standardized. So let me just dig into that just really quickly to make these points clear. So this is just a graph that shows true actual movement of Medicare beneficiaries across pairs of hospitals in the US. And I just think it's such a fun graph because it really shows, right? Like patients are moving around a lot. And you can see the snowbirds, and you can see, sort of, all the different patterns that you would expect. And so what we need is HIE that actually matches this graph, right? So that when patients are doing this movement, we can see that we can, capture their complete data. We use that data to do a survey of hospitals and ask them, are you actually exchanging data with the other hospital with which you share the highest volume of patients? So we actually tried to say, is HIE aligned with that graph I just showed you that shows patient travel patterns? And what we found was that in 63% of those pairs, they said that I am not or only a little bit interoperable with that other specific hospital. So I think this first problem that we need to solve, despite my telling you that there's a lot of infrastructure out there, is actually aligning that infrastructure with where patients are going to get care. And I think for LHS efforts, this is key, because if Michigan Medicine is doing an LHS project that relates to readmissions, you need to know all the places your patients are getting readmitted to. And so that requires HIE with the entities that might reasonably receive a readmission for someone that had been seen at Michigan Medicine. And again, I think you guys actually in Michigan are doing quite a good job with that, and I think you probably have a pretty good sense of that from the exchange that you're already participating in. But that's not true in many other places. So then this next point around lack of standardized ways to capture and exchange many important types of data. Again, this is just an example, patient-reported outcomes. Here's a case where we actually have a standard for patient-reported outcomes implementation. We have an implementation guide, it's FHIR-based. But if you look at the level of adoption and whether it's federally required, the answer is low and no. So here's an opportunity to say we actually have a standard, but the work is to not just have the standard, but to get it in common use. So if you're at the point of saying, I want to build a multi-stakeholder LHS effort around a given PRO, you can reasonably assume then that a given FHIR standard will be the one that's implemented so that you can have this PRO measured in a consistent way across all the people that might be contributing data. So you're going to have more content, I know, coming around HIE for research and aggregating data across different organizations. So this is just sort of scratching the surface, but just as a way of saying, I think it's not just moving the data, but ideally it's moving around standardized data. And we really need to come to some agreement on the standards that we use to encode really important data like patient-reported outcomes and social determinants, just to name a couple. Okay, so this is my last slide. So my prediction, I think, we've been on and will continue to be on a fairly incremental progress pathway. We will continue to make progress, but I don't think it's going to change, rapidly in the next, in the coming years. And I think a lot of the activity a lot of the progress will be seen around this notion of US core data for interoperability, because that is now the new standard for what EHRs need to be able to share. And it will be really important to expand US CDI over time so that the bar gets raised in terms of what all EHR systems need to be able to share. And I think we'll continue to use a mix of old school methods of exchange, HL7 version 2 interfaces, they're so widely adopted and in place. I think there'll be a lot of inertia there, but increasingly we'll see these new API-based approaches to exchange happening. I am, as I said, really watching the national networks in TEFCA that we talked about earlier to see how much engagement there is with this notion of a national network of networks. How do we connect up all these different networks that exist? If there's a lot of engagement with that, we could see, I think, a real bump in activity. I also think that we're going to see a lot more focus on not just data, core clinical data moving, but data about patients, race, ethnicity, neighborhood that they live in. A lot of the new activity I've seen around HIE is really making sure that we have comprehensive data that can allow us to speak to issues of equity, again, partly due to the pandemic. So I think we're really seeing a lot of focus on expanding the breadth of demographic and social determinants data that will be married to clinical data for exchange. And last but not least, I think as more data flows, there's just going to be more attention to the usability. So what is on the front lines for clinicians or others who are using data, what does this all look like? So that's, I think, one bucket of predictions. And the other is again, this intersection for HIE for research. You're going to have more on that coming in a future talk. But I'm just seeing more and more activity where both HIEs are thinking about whether that can be a core business, And, I got a call from all of us a few weeks ago, and they're like, there are these things called HIEs. Should we be talking to them? Like, could that be a source of data that could help expand the data that's available to all of us? So I think it will be interesting to see if research sort of gives HIEs like another, wind in their sails for ways that they could add value and frankly help in a substantive way, make more data accessible for research. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we at least have, we're almost out of time. All right, Doug, is there a last burning question you think we should address?
Well, I just give Chuck here an opportunity to react in any way he wants in the last 2 minutes we have.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Julia. I think we are toward the end of our time. I will make note of the many references you made to activities that are going to occur in this year's LHS Collaboratory series that build on many of the points you made. And I think that in our discussions that arise during those future presentations, we're going to take an opportunity to reflect back on some of the things you said, because these points are accumulating and building on one another. And I think you've really given us a foundation for developing much deeper insight into what might be possible with information mobility, not only for healthcare, but also for research and heaven knows public health. Applications of this have really come to the fore with the pandemic, and that's a whole other topic we need to be addressing. So thanks so much. You've provided a lot of useful information, and as I said, you've provided a foundation for a lot of the conversations we will be having in the future. And you'll always be a Wolverine, Julia. And I hope we can have further interactions with you as time goes on.
Of course, feel free. Anyone should feel free to reach out for any follow-up.
Okay, well, I think we're at the end of our time here. I want to thank everyone who helped out, including the staff who managed all this. And there is a post-event survey. We'd like very much if you would take a little time to fill that out. And the link to the materials, as you will see here, will be placed on the website archive. And we'll have our next event on January 18th. So we're looking forward to having you all with us again. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much, Julia.